All right, hey guys, so we're going to finish up lesson 9.4. We just have 3 quick graphing problems to do to build off of yesterday's graphing. So I'm just going to show you how to come up with the table of values, but I'm not going to actually plot the points for graphing. I think you can handle that on your own. I will, of course, post my answer key, so when you do the graphing, you can check to make sure you're graphing accurately. But if you can come up with the table of values, I'm pretty confident you can plot the points, okay? So I got us started by writing a bunch of the key information that we need to know. All right, so everything in black, you basically need to know in order to do the table of values for the transform graph and to come up with the graph, okay? So you need to know that A is going to be your vertical stretch or shrink, B is going to be your horizontal stretch or shrink, H is going to move the graph right and left, K is going to move us up and down, the amplitude is going to be equal to the absolute value of A, the period is 2 pi divided by the absolute value of B, your midline is equal to K, and then the parent functions, these are the key points that you have to be memorized because these are the key points that we then transform, okay? So the first graph that we're going to work with is g of x equals 3 sine 2x plus 1. So we have an a, a b, and a k value, okay? So the a value is a vertical stretch and shrink, and the k value moves us up and down. So a and k are always going to affect the y values, but b and h, horizontal stretch or shrink, moving right or left, that's all affecting the x values, okay? So to get started, since we have a vertical stretch of 3 and then we move up 1 unit, we're going to multiply all of the y values by 3 and then add 1. So we're in a sine function, all of these are going to get multiplied by 3 and then you're going to add 1. So we'll do that now. So taking the first y value, it's going to be 0 times 3 and then plus 1. So that's going to equal just a 1. And then I'm going to take a 1. So it's 1 times 3 and then plus 1. So 1 times 3 is 3 plus 1 is 4. All right. And then it's going to be 0 times 3 plus 1. You have another 1. Negative 1 times 3. Negative 1 times 3 is negative 3 plus 1, that's negative 2. And then 0 times 3 plus 1 is 1. All right? Okay, then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take care of the new x values. Again, what I said was the b and the h are going to affect the x values. So we have a b value. Okay, it's a horizontal shrink by a factor of 1/2. So I need to multiply all of the x values by the reciprocal of this, which is 1/2. So it's going to be 1/2 times x. Okay, so all of these x values get multiplied by 1/2. So it's 0 times 1/2, which is just a 0. Then it's pi over 2 times 1/2, pi over 2 times 1/2, which is pi over 4. Then it's pi times 1/2, which is pi over 2. Then we're going to multiply 3 pi over 2 times 1/2, 3 pi over 2 times 1/2, which is 3 pi over 4. And then we're going to multiply 2 pi times 1/2, which is just pi. Okay, so those would be the new points that you would graph for your transformed function. Okay, so we already stated the transformations. I'll go through them one more time since I didn't write them. Vertical stretch of 3, all right, horizontal shrink by 1/2, and then up 1 unit. All right, the last thing we're going to talk about is the amplitude and the period, and then we'll be done this graph and move on to the next. The amplitude is the absolute value of A. So the amplitude is 3. The period is equal to 2 pi divided by the absolute value of B. The B value is a 2, so it's 2 pi divided by 2, which means your period is just pi. Okay. All right, let's look at another graph. All right. So this function is g of x equals 2 cosine pi over 2 x plus 3. All right. So think about the x and the y values and the a, b, h, and k values. All right. So going through vertical stretch of 2. Okay. That's going to affect the y value. There is no k value, so that's the only thing affecting the y values. So all of your y's are going to be multiplied by 2. Okay, so we're cosine this time. So all these y's get multiplied by 2 for the parent function. So it's going to be 1 times 2 to get 2. Then it's 0 times 2 to get 0. Then negative 1 times 2 to get negative 2. 0 times 2 to get 0. And 1 times 2 to get 2. All right. Now, the h and the b value affect the x. So we have to multiply by the reciprocal, and then we have to shift 3 units. And do you remember, are we shifting right or left? We're moving left 3 units. So that means I'm going to multiply by the reciprocal and subtract 3. All right? So all of your x values are going to get multiplied by 2 over pi. And then after you do that, you're going to subtract 3. Okay? So multiply by 2 over pi, still going to be 0, and then subtract 3. That's negative 3. Multiply this by 2 over pi, and if you need to write it out, you can. So it's pi over 2 times 2 over pi. That's just a 1. And then after you get a 1, you subtract 3 to get a negative 2. Multiply this by 2 over pi. So pi times 2 over pi. That's going to simplify, right? The pi's cancel to just a 2, and then you subtract 3. Multiply 3 pi over 2. 3 pi over 2. Multiply that by 2 over pi. The 2's cancel and the pi's cancel, so you're just left with 3, and then you subtract 3 to get a 0. And finally, multiply 2 pi by 2 over pi. The pi's cancel, leaving you with 4. Then you subtract 3 to get a 1. All right? So let's go through again, talk about the transformations, the amplitude, and the period. Okay, so look at A, B, and H. It's a vertical stretch by 2. It's a horizontal shrink by 2 over pi. And it is shifting 3 units left. If you're not sure how I determine if it's a stretch or a shrink, you may want to convert that into a decimal value. Okay, so if you're not sure what that is, if you just do pi divided by 2 on your calculator, you get 1.57, whatever it is. And remember, for horizontal stretches and shrinks, if it's a number greater than 1, it's going to be a shrink by the reciprocal. So it's a shrink by 2 over pi. Okay? And we just have one more graph to look at today. All right. So the last graph is g of x equals negative 4 sine 1/2 x minus pi. Okay. So we're going to talk about all the same things we talked about in the last 2 problems. The 4 is a vertical stretch by 4. There's no k value, so we're just multiplying all the y's by 4. All right. It is a sine function, so I go to the parent sine function, multiply all the y's by 4. So it's going to be 0, 4, 0, negative 4, 0. Again, I just multiplied all these by 4. Now I have to look at the b and the h value to determine what's happening to the x's. All right. We are, oh, and the negative, by the way, that's a reflection. Okay, we're reflecting in the x-axis. But we're going to have a horizontal stretch by 2. So we're going to multiply all the x's by 2. 2 times x. And what else is happening? We are moving to the right by pi. All right, so you're going to add pi. So you have to multiply all of the x's by 2 and then add pi. All right, so 2 times 0 is just 0, and then 0 plus pi is going to be pi. Take the next x, which is pi over 2. So pi over 2 times 2 is going to be pi, and then you add a pi to get 2 pi. The next one is pi, so it's going to be 2 times pi, which is 2 pi, and then you add a pi to get 3 pi. You probably can see the pattern, so you could stop, but let's just keep going. So what am I up to? 3 pi over 2. So I'm going to take 3 pi over 2. I'm going to multiply by 2. That gives me 3 pi. Add pi to get 4 pi. And then finally, take 2 pi. Multiply by 2 to get 4 pi. And then add pi to get 5 pi. Okay. I think for the last one, I may have forgotten to talk about amplitude and periods. Let's make sure to do it here. So again, it's a reflection in the x, a vertical stretch by 4, a horizontal stretch by 2, and right by pi. You're adding pi, right by pi. So your amplitude is equal to the absolute value of a, so your amplitude is 4, and your period is 2 pi divided by the absolute value of b. So it's 2 pi divided by 1/2, or you can think of that as 2 pi times the reciprocal, which is 4 pi. And you can see that as well. All right. That is it. That is it, guys. So like I said, I didn't take the time to do the graphing, but I'm pretty confident you can do the graphing on your own once you know the coordinates to plot. So jump on over to the online textbook, get that homework done, and I'll see you back here for the last section of this chapter.